Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman, and today we're going to revisit the topic of AI driven testing. We covered this sometime early this year, maybe last year, and we're not going to put years on so you don't know, where we talked about the state of AI testing and whether having AI write unit tests is useful. And we generally said it's not really there. Like it will be useful, but it's not really useful super much yet. I think was our conclusion. But we were at, you gave me an article yesterday by a company called Codium AI, where they ran with something that I guess Meta, Facebook said that they did, where they moved the tool chain forward. So they had, okay, we can have AI generate mostly useless tests, and then they gave it a feedback loop of, okay, now we've given it a way to verify which ones are actually useful. And for those who haven't read the article, they had the AI generate tests, and then the test had to compile and run, and then the test had to increase code coverage. And then if it did all those things, then it would get kicked to a human to verify that the test was worth looking at. And so I think they said 75 or 80% of their tests that the AI wrote didn't pass that threshold. But once it got to the point where, it did run and it did improve code coverage, they accepted like 2/3 of them.
Yeah.
And so it's useful.
Yeah, it's very useful. And I sent you this article yesterday mainly because I had actually been discussing something really similar to this back in November of last year. Because I was thinking, it would be actually essentially what I was doing on a side project of mine was using ChatGPT and other LLMs to try to generate tests for old code. And it was pretty bad most of the time what was generated, but it was bad just in that it didn't run and that it didn't cover everything, but there was a couple of things about it that were okay. And so what I did was I kept changing my prompts to get like more granular with how I wanted the style to look or how I wanted the test names to be formatted or what kind of libraries I wanted to use. So it didn't try to introduce new libraries that were pretty much the same as my old libraries. Because sometimes there'll be like alternatives to things like in Jest. You might use like enzyme sometimes for React, and sometimes you don't want to use enzyme. So I tried to. What I realized after I was generating these tests is that I was generating a test, copying and pasting it, seeing if it ran, seeing if it increased code coverage, and if it didn't, to go back, change the prompt, try it again. And after a while, I'm like, I'm doing a loop.
Yeah.
I should automate this loop so that it's not just a human doing it. And then I got to thinking about the same thing that I guess some engineers at Meta also did. It looks like a few months ago they released their version of this, the large language model, the TestGen LLM. And they got a lot of bad feedback on it.
I didn't realize they released it. I thought it was an internal thing. They just talked about
it. Yeah, their internal product does this. So a few months ago they released, or they didn't release, but they said they were using this internal model, and they put a big post on it, and a lot of people complained about it on Hacker News or wherever, about like, oh, it generates crap tests, blah blah blah, this and that. And I get that. Every time I mention using ChatGPT for coding, I get a weird look from people. From people who are non-engineers are like, "Whoa, they're going to replace engineers," and people who are engineers are like, "Oh, this it generates crap code," but it does a decent job at a lot of different things. Namely, like regex generation. It does do a pretty good job at old PHP unit tests. At least my prompts have been great. I'll change one or two things, and it actually helps me write some pretty useful ones very quickly, without a lot of different edge cases covered.
Your code base must be good, because for me, and I'm working with a legacy code base that we'll be polite and say it started as a PHP 4 project and evolved organically. And, so it's a mishmash of styles over multiple decades.
Yeah.
And it doesn't do that well yet.
Well,
and it's hard. It's hard.
It's hard, and I understand. I guess my argument is not necessarily that this is going to be a perfect tool.
Yeah.
My suggestion is just like before we had IDEs. We just had to pay attention to make sure that variable was used somewhere before the IDEs got smart enough to gray out the variable and show, oh, you didn't actually use this function, or you imported something, but you actually didn't use this thing. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it just got committed. And then later we're like, oh, that's really nice. This is really helpful. The IDE is taking care of this thing for me.
You
I
say
think there will be
committed like
some.
there was source control. Before there were IDEs, most people weren't using source control either.
Before IDEs got like, well, I'll also say very memory intensive, but like PHP Storm, for example, super memory intensive, but does a lot of really cool things. And they started implementing their own version of like Copilot, GitHub Copilot, basically recently, and that'll help you, code alongside. And just like anything else, if you use some kind of LLM for coding, it'll get it wrong sometimes. But like if you're trying to type through them and create a factory of something, it's incredibly useful. It can see, oh, your recent, especially if you're using something like TypeScript and you've already typed like a whole type out with all the different, like imagine like a user model and all the different
Mm-hmm.
things, like this is a string, this is integer, blah blah blah, and you're trying to generate a factory for testing. Boom, it can get you 20 of those very quickly, or help you use some kind of library like I guess Faker would be the JS version, but or maybe there's a PHP version too. But either way,
Who knows?
it'll create all these. It does a really good job at making those speeding up that process for you. So all that to say, um, what this other company did, Codium, is basically they're trying to implement this into a CI/CD pipeline where you can plug it in. It will try to run tests for you. If it generates good tests that increase the coverage, then they'll try to include it as part of, I'm assuming it's going to be part of the MR or some kind of process where a human can review it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but either way, it doesn't have to be perfect. But if it can help some of the coverage, or at least get people thinking about testing, like, oh, actually, I didn't include a test. This one generated a crappy test, but actually, there's a good point. I didn't have a test in my MR. Let me go back and add that. I'm going to tweak the thing that it generated and add a good one. That's still a good
Mm-hmm.
move forward, I think.
Even a crappy test that works and improves code coverage is better than no tests. So I'm actually I now that it's got a feedback loop to minimize, well, to get you a reasonable amount of human interaction, I
Mm-hmm.
would actually be very much in favor of, set it up. You've got some hairy code. You think you know what it does, but you don't really know what it does, and you've got like no test coverage.
Mm-hmm.
Let it build some tests. The tests are probably gonna be
Yeah.
weird,
Yeah.
but
It
that's
will be weird.
better than nothing. Because to me, like if you got to 100% test coverage, even if you didn't understand the test at all, right? You don't understand the code, and now you don't understand the tests,
Mm-hmm.
but you have tests that you have high confidence will tell you if something changed. Now you can
Yes,
start
exactly.
refactoring the code.
Yeah, and so this is where I raise my eyebrow too, because I'm thinking, let's pretend this particular product takes off, it gets better over time, it starts writing better tests, and then we essentially get kind of a boost after people start using this to test coverage in libraries across different companies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we do have a certain threshold, then again, let's just take this to another conclusion. Let's just plug in another product, a refactoring product that
Mm-hmm.
tries to refactor itself based on high code coverage. If you have 95% code coverage, look at our tests, find a way to cleanly refactor it, run the tests. Do they still run? Great. You know, and you can have something that's like going through and continually improving itself, or breaking code into smaller modules and smaller testable functions, and just kind of cleaning things up, finding shared functions. Um, that will be kind of a cool future where you have something
Mm-hmm.
continually cleaning up behind itself.
Right, and it doesn't. In this example, remember we're starting with shit, and
Mm-hmm.
like it's not like this is pristine code and you would care. Like if it evolves and it's weird but understandable, that's a huge improvement over weird and not understandable, which is where a lot of like the legacy code, if you're in the never rewrite question, or if you're like, I have to rewrite this, it's like, well, our whole thesis is it's not by the time you understand the code well enough to rewrite it, you will have rewritten it effectively. Or by the time to replace it, you will have fixed all the problems. And this is
Mm-hmm.
just lowers the barrier. Like, okay, yeah, this code's
Right.
terrible, and I don't understand it. Okay, cool. Let the LLM, hack away at it, flail. Really, you don't care. It's
Yeah.
bad.
Just press the button and let it just at least attempt.
And if it gets to 100% code coverage, then at least, okay, now you can confidently start refactoring the code. And when it breaks, you'll learn, like, even if you don't understand the tests, when it
Yeah.
breaks, if you're doing it in, you now have tests, make a change, run the test, make the change, run the test. Like, you,
Yeah.
you will
And
understand when you hit it.
there are some people who say that bad tests are better than, or no tests are better than bad tests, which would be a counter to kind of your argument earlier. Like if it does something and improves it, I think in this case it doesn't really matter if they're crappy tests because if you can actually refactor your code, like bad code produces bad tests. It's really hard. You have to mock everything. It's super difficult to test everything. There's a lot of weird. Now you have to like use some kind of reflection thing in PHP to test a private method because in this case you want to test a private method because the code's so old. You're not worried about the bad smell of testing private methods, that kind of thing. But then if you add enough coverage and you factor to make cleaner code, then you go back and refactor the tests you wrote and make cleaner tests. So I think it's just good scaffolding going forward. I think having an automation through this process would be great. A code that can clean itself up or make itself more readable. We've already seen, the other AI companies that add comments to code.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to help you understand the code. Um, I think if we can kind of embrace this idea as like this is not just replacing developers, but this is like another tool to help deliver more quality code or
Right.
standardized code, or just even be just the expected part of your pipeline. Is let's make sure that we're cleaning up some unused code or you know dead code, uh, adding
Well,
test areas. I think this is still a great step forward.
certainly in the case that I'm imagining, and I don't know if you're imagining the same case, but like a case where you've inherited some code and you don't understand what it does, right?
Yeah.
The bad tests are worse than no tests is if you write a bad test, it's going to force you to then write the future code in a bad way to keep the tests working. But
Hmm.
here it's like you don't know what this code does and you almost don't care. Like you care what it's not that you don't care what it does, but like you're not trying to maintain that to move forward with this code. You don't know what this code does. You don't have any confidence that you like it's
Yeah.
probably wrong in subtle ways, but it's what's been running in production for years, so it's correct
Exactly.
within the confines of this is what our customers expect. And so yeah, you have the LLM write tests and the tests are crappy because the code is crappy. You've still moved forward, right?
I think so, especially in my line of work, so to speak, where I'm going through
Mm-hmm.
my main job is to go through make improvements to code without affecting the current behavior. I don't
Right.
make any assumptions about like what it should be doing. Yeah, like, oh, this would be a nice way to clean it up. I don't clean it up. I don't do the Boy Scout rule with leave it cleaner than you found. If I come there and there's like bad code, and I just leave it there. I don't touch it because I could break it. One small
Right.
thing that I think that I know about it, I could break it if there's no coverage. So slapping some kind of test coverage there as scaffolding to protect me or at least characterize the current behavior of the system is great for me because I,
Yeah.
I want to make the the least offensive changes possible coming into a system I know nothing about.
Right. I think that's a good distinction. Like we are not saying that this is going to free you from having to write tests for the code that you're writing. You
Right.
absolutely should write code. When you write your code, you should absolutely write tests. And this is not a shortcut that will save you from doing that. Especially because if you wrote code and then you had the LLM write the test, you haven't you don't have a real test. You have a test that characterizes whatever you wrote. And so
Hmm.
if you wrote it wrong in the first place,
Yep. You'll get a
then
test
the
asserting your
test
bad
is
behavior.
yeah the test is going to assert what your wrong thing. Uh, and so like it's not useful for new code. It's only useful this tool chain where we are now is only useful is most useful I should say, not only useful. Like the big value proposition here is legacy code where you don't know what it does,
Yeah. Well,
but it's in
actually, yeah,
production.
I agree with that distinction because my main argument is coming from that perspective of somebody whose job it is to go through and refactor legacy code, particularly. I wouldn't use it just to kind of shortcut everything. At least for
Mm-hmm.
now. Maybe in the future. I'm not even. I'm leaving that argument for a separate time. But for my case here,
Oh, that day
it would provide
will
great
probably come.
scaffolding. Yeah.
My
So
worry
yeah.
would
Either
be
way.
is the
Sorry.
you
Go
know
ahead.
the just my worry is that the LLM doesn't know, right. If you write code and then have the LLM write a test, because a lot of times I will write code and then I'll write the test, and the test will fail because my code was wrong, and then I'll fix the code, right, instead of doing the, I guess,
Yeah.
test first, write the test and then write the code. I typically write the code and then I write the test, and then if the test doesn't pass the way I expected it to, I go back and fix it. And this would not, like, an LLM isn't going to know that, and so it would write the test to pass whatever you've written, and then you would have to go through and read the test and understand it, and that would be much harder in my mind.
Maybe. What about adding more context and prompt to the LLM itself? Like instead of just giving it code, say, I work at a company that does X, Y, and Z. Our intention is for this and this and this to happen. With that in mind, let's get started refactoring this code and see if it can kind of use that to help guide and maybe like catch you if you try to do something that would be against what your proposed business intention would be.
Well, so we're moving from test to refactor. I
We
think you
are.
are. I think you're massively underestimating how good automated refactoring tools are. Uh, I expect you could easily, like, in PHP, there's a tool called Rector. I think it's in many other languages too.
Mm-hmm.
But it will tell you, hey, like, this function is too complex. Or, you can get cyclomatic complexity scores,
Yeah.
all of these things. And if you take that as prompts, like, the warnings spitting out by your code quality tools can become the prompts for your refactoring. This function has too much cyclomatic complexity. Break it into pieces.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't my argument.
Oh,
I agree that that's a great way to actually reduce complexity. And that's kind of like more the mathematical way to say this is too complicated. You can simply make it into smaller pieces and test those pieces. I was suggesting that as you're writing code or fixing code, if you provided some kind of context to an LLM about what you're doing, maybe at some point in the future, as you're coding something, it could say, but remember, you're also a company that's trying to do this. So you may want to consider X, Y, and Z in addition to it, like providing it business context as you would a human. Because over time, you can actually go
well,
ahead.
I was going to make a comment that most developers don't understand the business that they're in and make all kinds of dumb mistakes.
Exactly. But what if your helper, your Copilot helper, does understand the business because you basically gave it all of your business concepts as part of like a context that you're working within. So as you try to refactor something or build something, it can kind of help guide you too. Again, we're going off crazy, maybe not too
Yeah,
crazy, but going off, one field there away from this particular implementation. I just think I think it's a kind of a cool thing because you can talk to an LLM and you can build this kind of large prompt over time,
mm-hmm.
and it does get pretty clever at trying to understand what you're trying to do. And I wonder what that world looks like for new engineers 10 years from now. What expectations um, are had, or what things that are kind of solved for, or that we expect. Like, I imagine if so much of this code can be cleaned up, automated, you get a lot of help from LLMs from understanding how to write the best code for your business curated LLMs.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of code would we expect out of a junior developer coming up now that so much can be generated and there's so much help? Uh, I
Yeah,
wonder what
I
that
could
looks
just
like.
imagine a pretty good tool that I've never heard of. Now that you've said it, but it would be a business like an LLM where you feed it everything about your business so that it understands. For instance, the an example that I have gone with. I have read. I've worked in regulated business, regulated environment. I have worked in industries that are highly regulated and also highly studied, and like they're literally textbooks. And feeding an LLM like, here's the textbook about how this works, and here's the laws and regulations, and now every developer has
Right.
on their desktop, access to the semi-legal department of, hey, I want to do this. Is this an okay thing to do? And it could spit off yes or no, and take run it by legal, but just in a general concept, like, is this the right thing to be
Yeah.
doing? Kind of talking to your local expert.
That's kind of what I was getting at with the testing and the coding. Like if you give
Mm-hmm.
it that kind of context for what you're doing and compliance issues, then if you tried to build something that cut out, like, for example, if I was trying to clean up something related to, we have this, whenever we move money, we have to check them against like a terrorist list and do a couple other kind of
Mm-hmm.
audits. What if I did something that evaded that check? In my code, I skipped it somehow, and then the LLM was like, "Oh, but keep in mind, the code you removed actually is a part of an important auditing part of your application that
Right.
you need to have to remain compliant." Things like that that can kind of link to help you remember business parts. That way you don't just make a computer decision about like, "Oh, this logic area I've skipped because I was trying to make my code faster or whatever." Now it's like,
Right.
"Oh, you can't skip that because of the business thing that you've just changed by accident." So that would be a really cool idea, and I'm sure someone's working on that already.
Yeah.
If I was
That.
thinking about the idea of this back in November and Meta released it 3 months later, then they clearly also had the idea for a while.
Yeah, that goes straight to I'd be afraid. Just with legal advice, 80%, 90% is not nearly good enough.
Oh, you don't trust it. You use it to help guide you, and then you go, wait a minute, it flagged this. Let me run it by the legal team to make sure it wasn't hallucinating because they're prone to hallucinate. But
Mm-hmm.
again, it's not going to be perfect. A lot of these arguments are like, this one thing here proves that nothing you say can work. And I'm like, no, it can still help you. Now you're reflecting about the business. Before you weren't thinking about the business at all as a developer.
Right.
A lot of times we aren't. This kind of helps bring that to the forefront, even if it's semi correct.
Yeah, it probably would still be a net benefit, but in those cases, like where
Yeah,
there's actual laws, you definitely don't want to trust it.
right. But the LLM told me it was okay to
The LLM
skip checking
cited a law
against the
that doesn't
terrorist list.
the
Yeah,
LLM cited
exactly.
a law that doesn't exist that said I could do exactly what I wanted.
Why did you build this feature? Oh, the LLM said that this was required in our field. That's not required. You spent
Yeah.
3 days on nothing.
Yeah, you spent
Yeah.
3 days in building a hallucination that makes our system not function.
Either way, I think it's a really cool concept, and even if there's still human intervention to kind of show you from what Codium's AI thing attempt is doing. At least there's like there's human review for like to make sure it doesn't generate something kind of crazy. These things will get better over time. That loop will
Yeah.
get closed over time. Um, I'm kind of excited, at least again from somebody who spends their time under the hood every day, basically trying to figure out brand new systems given to me. Stuff like this could really help me make an impact without doing too dangerous or risky changes, or even de-risk a lot of changes that I want to make.
Right. That is my main takeaway here is this would not quite there, but when they tighten the loops a bit, being able
Mm-hmm.
to set it free on legacy code and have it build up a test suite, even if the tests are weird, would massively de-risk, legacy system rescue kind of stuff. DC shipping your
Mm-hmm.
way out of a disaster.
And I bet you we'll have a conversation about this maybe in 2 years about somebody's new automated refactoring tool.
I look forward to it. I think it's awesome. All
All
right.
right.
Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.